Today we are going to discuss what the Buddha awakened upon. That is called dependent arising, which is a major Buddhist teaching. In other words, all other Buddhist teachings we can see is based on this one very important Buddhist principle called dependent arising. And the dependent arising we can see is when the Buddha sat down at the Bodhi tree and he truly awakened. And this awakening we can see is not only about human beings, but the whole world. In other words, when the Buddha awakened upon this, what is called dependent arising is a principle governing the whole universe. Today, physical science has already approved this. In other words, today's physical science taught us in this universe, everything is dependent on each other. And this is called cause and effect, law of the nature. So this is a major discovery. That's why the Buddha called him, saying that he got this awakened to the universal law of this truth. Of course, Buddhism used this truth to explain human life. That is the second aspect. So this universal truth tells us is that in this world, everything is connected. Nothing is independent. In other words, our life connects with everything else in this world. That's why today, people realize that environment are so important for the happiness of human beings. If we destroy the environment, we human beings will suffer. That's because we depend on each other. So this is a truth the Buddha realized under the Bodhi tree. And also, these early Chinese philosophers also discovered the same kind of things. For example, Lao Tzu from Taoism, he discovered the same kind of things. He called it Tao. That is a universal truth. Therefore, in Taoism, saying that the nature is something we shall not disturb it. So he realized that nature works according to its own law. If we disturb this law, then we as human beings will be affected. Therefore, Lao Tzu also awakened to the same kind of truth. But Lao Tzu, of course, did not like Buddhism, given a specific name. Buddhism gave it a name, dependent arising. That is a very important idea. The Buddha realized it. So this dependent arising to Buddhism is so important, it demonstrates in these sayings. It says, one who sees dependent arising sees Dhamma. Dhamma here refers to the entire Buddhist teaching. One who sees Dhamma sees dependent arising. In other words, if you understand dependent arising, you understand the entire Buddhist teaching. If you understand the entire Buddhist teaching, you must understand dependent arising. If you don't understand dependent arising, that does not mean that you understand Buddhist teachings. So that is so important to Buddhism. That's why we say that in Mahayana Buddhism, we say the Buddha exists everywhere, and even now and here. Why? Because the entire universe, everything, is a demonstration of this dependent arising, this one single truth. So this single truth is symbolized by the Buddha. So we call the Buddha is an embodiment of this truth. That's why it's so important. But of course, to Buddhism, the most important part is to apply this truth to human life. That is a major thing, because Buddha, his main emphasis is human life. And the Buddha wanted to solve human problems. Buddhism, although care about the environment, care about the animals, care about the outside, all other things, but the major concern for Buddhism is still human life. So human life is the most important thing. That's why dependent arising come back to analyze human life. In other words, our human life is also depends on many causes and conditions. Continues as a cause effects. Therefore, it's under such kind of important Buddhist teaching. Later on, the Buddha developed other kind of teachings based on this, what we call the Noble Effort Path, Four Noble Truths. We discussed in January. We have 2 lectures. And today we will, of course, discuss dependent arising. Tomorrow we will discuss karma. Because generally we discussed the Four Noble Truths, Noble Effort Path, mainly are these. So the dependent arising in Buddhism given as a very short formula. This very short formula is called, when this is, that is. This arising, that arises. When this is not, that is not. This ceasing, that ceases. So this is a very important formula, and this formula demonstrates that in this world, everything depends on everything else. Nothing is independent. So that is a very important idea. And this idea can apply to the universe, can apply to the human beings. Since we as humans, we live in the universe, therefore our life is also governed by the same kind of law called dependent arising. It's a very important idea. So the implication of this theory, there are few very important, is that because everything in this world is interdependent, depends on each other, therefore nothing is permanent. That's why Buddhism comes to the conclusion saying that everything is impermanent, everything is changing. It's all coming from here because of this most important Buddhist principle. And from this principle, come to the conclusion that everything changing, everything impermanent. So that become one of the very important, outlook for human life. That is a Buddhist way of looking at life. Everything is changing. Nothing is permanent. That is the most important Buddhist idea. Second, since everything in this world is interrelated, interdependent, interrelated, therefore nothing is independent. That's why Buddhism rejects the idea of God, rejects the idea of a soul, because soul, God, by definition, they are permanent, independent of everything else. Buddhism does not recognize these kind of things because this basic principle does not allow any kind of permanent, independent entities. So this second interpretation is very important. The first two demonstrate the Buddhist idea is very different from all other world religions, which recognize God, which is permanent, everlasting. Last one saying that everything in this world is interdependent, interrelated, and relative. In other words, one relates to others. Therefore, nothing is absolute. So Buddhism recognizes all these kind of ideas. So all these ideas are rejected. That's why Buddhism comes to the conclusion saying that everything in this world is interdependent, interrelated, relative. Everything. That's why here, Buddhism, totally and rejecting the idea of an everlasting entity, any kind of name. Some other religion given as a God, Atma, soul, so many different kind of names. All these are rejected by Buddhism. Why? Because they cannot stand with this truth, which is the Buddha's entire awakening. So that is a very important idea that make Buddhism stand out from all other religions in the world. None of the religion saying these kind of things. Even the very idea of a soul is rejected because major religions in the world all recognize the soul. But Buddhism is a religion, perhaps it's the only religion which rejects the soul. That is very particular with all world religions. Why? It's because of these theories. So this theory does not allow any kind of a permanent entity, whether you give it as a soul, God, or Atma, or any kind of things, all are rejected. So that is a very important thing. Why it's rejected? Because of this theory called dependent arising. So that is so important. It is from this theory there come to this a few conclusions or suggestions you can see. There is no single cause leading to a multiple effects given any phenomenal worlds. All other religions, in Buddhism, of course, related to is Hinduism, because Buddhism originated in India. In Hinduism, God created everything in this world. So Buddhism totally rejects these things because Buddhism says there's no such kind of thing as a single cause leading to multiple effects, no such kind of things. Only thing is multiple effects, multiple causes leading to multiple effects. We will discuss this a little bit later. That's why Buddhism rejects the idea of God creation, entirely rejected. There could not be. Second is Buddhism also rejects single cause leading to a single effect. Sometimes there are also multiple causes leading to a single effect. That also could not be. So all these are also rejected because in India there are so many different kind of philosophers and also religious teachers giving so many different kind of proposals about the world, including here. It's so many of them. But Buddhism all rejected these kind of ideas as well. And third is they rejected theory of everything happened haphazardly. In other words, everything happened without a cause. Buddhism also rejected this. Buddhism says nothing happened by chance. Everything happened due to causes and conditions. We can't find anything happening without any cause. And that's why, because of this, Buddhism also rejects the idea of strict fatalism, strict determinism. These are two. You must remember here, not only fatalism, strict, not only determinism, strict determinism. Because sometimes other philosophers also thinking that Buddhist idea of cause and effect perhaps also a kind of a determinism. But Buddhism rejects strict determinism. All these are rejected. And here the implication is that Buddhism also recognizes free will. In other words, we as human beings, we can choose what we want. If given a situation, there are so many choices, then we can exercise our free will to choose the things we like and we want. If there is a strict either determinism, that means we are not allowed to choose anything because there's a cause leading to an effect. That is already said. But Buddhism does not believe these kind of things regard to human life. That's why for Buddhism, totally reject fortuitarian. Fortuitarian means that there are everything strictly determined or fatalism. Because determined, there is a causes, then you certainly can predict the consequences. Buddhism says there are causes. Because there's multiple causes, then the consequences also multiple. We don't know what will happen. And in between, there is, as we discussed earlier, free will. Concerning human life, free will is the most important thing. Because of the free will, that's why Buddhism rejects these two. You cannot predict the future exactly. You can predict roughly something, but you can never say exactly what will happen in the future. That's why I come to the important Buddhist idea is that always there is no exception. Multiple causes leading to multiple effects. That is the Buddhist position. In other words, according to the Buddhist analysis of the world and human life, everything happening in this world is multiple causes leading to multiple effects. That's why in our society, politicians wanted to try to solve one problem. Therefore, they did for many years. They could not solve the problem. Why? Because that problem, is caused by many causes, and effect also many. If you take only one cause or one effect to deal with, cannot. That's why it's very difficult to see. Therefore, Buddhism always say, you need to look into the roots. The roots could be many causes. Just like, similes, you have a rice plant, mango plant, for example. You plant a mango seeds, and in the future, certainly there will be a mango tree comes up. That is a possibility. Given the, other conditions, for example, although there is a mango seed, you must have a good soil, you must have a water, you must have a sunshine, and the temperature, so many other conditions. If lacking one of the conditions, although there is a seed, although there is water, although there is other things, without sun, without warmth, then there will never be a mango tree. That's why there are many causes and conditions leading to the fruit. There will be a mango tree. Therefore, Buddhism says, any kind of situation given, you must trace the causes to many causes, not only one cause. Therefore, Buddhism, to the human life, when we apply these kind of ideas, principles to human life, is that Buddhism never blame anybody directly. But Buddhism always say you have the responsibility for your life and for others. Responsibility is very important because there are so many causes to our life. Although, you must be the very direct cause to your life, but there are also other conditions contributing to your happy life. That's why Buddhism always talk about responsibilities. Never blame anybody. Not like other religions blaming you and punish you. Buddhism never punish anybody. You have this cause, naturally leading to such kind of consequences. That's why Buddhism so much emphasizes on our responsibility for our life. If our life is miserable, you should not blame anybody else. You should blame yourself. That is a very important thing because today, many people, in fact, when they get sick, when they get health problems, they blame all others, their parents, the society, the government. In fact, the true causes is within themselves. They did not lead a, balanced, good life. So Buddhism always talking about responsibilities for us, for family, for society, all the things. That's why here Buddhism rejected all this fatalism, strict determinism. Everything happened due to haphazard cause, without a cause, due to chance. All these kind of things are rejected. Buddhism only accepts is multiple causes leading to multiple effects, so many causes leading to so many consequences. That is a Buddhist idea. The second very important thing to Buddhism is that this, what we call the dependent arising, Buddhism always named it as a middle teaching. That is very important. Here, middle teaching refers to, different kinds of interpretation about human life. Because in India, there are so many religions, teachers, philosophers, interpret human life differently. But Buddhism basically rejected, all these extreme views. These extreme views, Buddhism discussed in one of the Buddhist texts. It's called Brahmajara Sutta. It's listed 62 different views. 62 different views. That means in India, so many different kind of philosophers, religions, discussing human life, they have so many different kind of views. But Buddhism classified these 62 different views into two groups. One is called metaphysical thesis of eternalism. That is one. Second is annihilationism. So the first one, in fact, it refers to all those religions, they think that there is a soul within our human beings. The soul is permanent, everlasting, continue from this life to next life, continue to many lives. And Buddhism thinking that is the one extreme views. Because as we said earlier, dependent arising does not allow these kind of things. That's why Buddhism rejects these views. Because in India, not only one religion, but many religions, they have this kind of view. There is a permanent entity called soul. But on the other hand, there are so many other religions also reject the idea of a soul. They recognize only the present life. When we die, everything ends up. There are also many religions. So Buddhism also calls this as annihilationist. In other words, when we die, everything ends up. How can we explain morality to next life? That's why Buddhism criticized these two kind of extreme views, and then Buddhism say the dependent arising is a middle teaching by transcending or giving up, abandoning two different kind of extreme views. So all these extreme views are abandoned. That's why Buddhism called the middle way. In other words, this dependent arising called the middle teaching also implies that we as human beings, we shall not have any kind of extreme views, because extreme views are more dangerous than, we adopted an extreme way of life. Why? Because when our mind goes to the extreme, then we can easily sacrifice our life. We won't, sacrifice our life for something material things. But we can easily sacrifice our life for spiritual things, for ideas. For example, today we call it terrorism. Why those people like to even sacrifice their life doing that kind of a dangerous thing? Because their mind has gone to the extreme views. That's why Buddhism, dependent arising, saying that's a middle teaching, is let us to know that any kind of extreme view is dangerous for us, dangerous for all of us, because it's likely that we might sacrifice our life. That's why Buddhism go to the middle path. Middle path in the way of thinking. In the way of thinking, always analyze everything to its causes and conditions. That is a Buddhist way of life, very important. That's why here I just quote a few from the Buddhist text. It's called the Kachanagota Sutta. They say, this word Kachana, that is Buddha's disciple, for the most part depends on dualities, upon the notion of existence, upon the notion of non-existence. But for one who sees the origin of the world as it really is, with the correct wisdom, there is no notion of non-existence in regarding to the world. And for one who sees the cessation of the world as it really is, with the correct wisdom, there is no notion of existence in regarding to the world. So here refers to two extreme views. In other words, you must not only see one aspect of the life. You must say both sides. There is both sides. Therefore, the Buddha said, all exist, Kachayana, is one extreme. All does not exist is a second extreme. Without veering towards either of this extreme, Tathagata, here referred to the Buddha, teaches the Dhamma by the middle. By the middle, he means transcending all these different kind of views, ideas, thoughts. So these ideas, thoughts, why they stick to this kind of views, Buddhism say, all coming back as psychological causes. In other words, their mind, their reasoning, not using what we call the wise attention, Yonika Manasikara. That means you must have a rational way of thinking. When you have a rational way of thinking, you see the things arising, you also see the things disappearing on both sides. So that is a very important idea. And this idea, that's why maybe all of you, learning Buddhism, you know that Buddhism is a middle teaching. Middle teaching here refers to dependent arising. That's a very important idea. It is from here, then Buddhism applies this kind of teaching to analyze human life. Then they use 12-fold formulas. That is, apply this dependent arising, the universal law, to human life. In India, there are so many different kind of views about the world and also about human life. For example, this Brahmana Sutta and also other suttas discuss this. Some of the Indian philosophers and religious teachers, they say everything is a unity. They say only one thing. Others say everything is a plurality. So from the idea of creation, they say the unity. When they say the objective world, they say the plurality. These are the two aspects of seeing the world. Then some others say, does everything exist or does everything not exist? This is also another kind of views. So Indian religious teachers, in fact, in so many different ways, they argue at the debate. Argue at the debate about all these kind of philosophical ideas. Then the Buddha told them, all these are just looking at the phenomena only through one aspect. And then they stick to their own views and then argue each other. That's why Buddhism is saying that we are teaching the middle path, transcending all these kind of views. Today also, in our life, we argue, we debate in so many different kind of ways, and we only holding up of our views and do not listen to the other views because we attach to our views so much. We don't want to give up. That's why the world is quarreling. That's why we have so many conflict, different kind of conflict, and in our family, in our community, in our society, all these kind of things. So Buddhism recognizes the roots to this conflict to our psychology. The psychology is that we attach to our views too much. That's why Buddhism says, transcending all these views, these philosophical views, and giving up these views, then, we can come to a, harmonious, living together. That's why Buddhism resort to Buddhism, when they analyze the universe, analyze human life, using both methods called analysis and also synthesis. When we say synthesis, using dependent arising is a synthesis. So you taking all the phenomena together and analyze, then you come to the conclusion everything depends on everything else. So that is called synthesize. So we discussed already dependent arising, synthesize. But at the same time, Buddhism also uses analysis, another method. Analyze the single whole thing into different parts. And usually in the philosophical class, they will ask a student to see the forest as well as the individual trees. You not only see the forest, but you should also see the individual trees. Then you can see the true forest. So when this kind of idea applied to human life is that the 5 aggregates, for example, 12 bases, 18 elements, all are analyzed human life into different parts. Particularly the 5 aggregates. These are consisted of human life, and this aggregate, in fact, is a Buddhist analysis of cognition process. Resulting in these two kind of methods, so you can see the full picture. So that is a very important idea. That's why Buddhism say, if you use only one method, you only see one part of the picture. It's only when you use two methods, you see the whole picture, a complete picture. That is a very important idea. And when this applies to human life, in India, so many different kind of religions having different kind of ideas. Some say suffering are created by ourselves. Some say suffering created by others. There are so many different kind of arguments. So this is a sutta, Kassapa Sutta. And when these, questions proposed and discussed with the Buddha in fact saying that all these are not correct understandings. All these are looking from one part of the life, not the whole picture. Therefore, the Buddha says, renouncing all these possibilities, then the Buddha says, he teaches the middle way. Middle way means dependent arising. You analyze. When you analyze, you find so many causes and conditions. That's why it's here, applied to human life, they come up from ignorance, leading to, consciousness, and then going on. 12 of all these applications. So this is an idea always saying that when any kind of issue or problem presented to the Buddha always through analytical method to solve the problem, not to stick to only one of them. Otherwise, then we will end up in extreme views. That's why the Buddha using this idea mainly to analyze human life. Here is a little bit, but of course, maybe a little bit difficult to understand. So according to the Buddhist idea, human life is only a process of a dependent arising and ceasing. In other words, our life is always changing, continuously developing. So that is a very important idea. In fact, that is the truth in our life. We all of us, we want to stay young. We want to be 18, 20. That is the best part of our life. But none of us can keep that. After 20, 30 years, we become old. After another 100 years, we are going to die. These kind of forces, nobody can change. The Buddha realized these things. And even the Buddha cannot change this life process. Only thing is that he told us we have to accept this process. That is a very important idea. That's why none of us, we can against old age. In China, so many powerful emperors, Qin Shi Huang, for example, he does not want to die. But he still died. Chinese Taoism, for example, the practice of Taoism is mainly to get longevity, live forever. But None of the Taoists live forever. All of them died in the past. Of course, some of them lead a quite old age. For example, Song Simiao in the Tang Dynasty, he's a Taoist, he's a practicing Chinese physician, and according to report, he lived up to 170. That is a very old age. But still he died. That's why Buddhism says human life is only a process. Process continue. So when we realize this, human life is only a process, then we will not to attach to a particular moment or particular thing because everything is changing. So that is a very important idea to us. That's why Buddhism says everything is impermanent, changing, and we should adopt an attitude towards life as everything is changing. When we accept changing, when we embrace changing, then we will be happy because when everything changes, it's become a nature. The Buddha says that our mind, whenever when we think on something, bent on something, our mind is always gradually turned on that directions. That means when we always thinking about changing, impermanence, our mind will go that directions. So that is a very important idea. So this, of course, it's discussed in the Visuddhimagga, one of the very important Theravada Buddhist book. And here is a little bit philosophical maybe. It says, and with the stream of continuity, there is neither identity nor otherness. For if there were absolute entity in a stream of the continuity, there would be no forming of curd from milk. And yet, if there were absolute otherness, the curd would not be derived from milk. And so too, with all kosher arising things. In other words, everything is a process, always changing. So that is the most important thing. When this dependent arising applied to human life, understand human life is only a process. Very important realization. That's why we say that the Buddha realized the universal truth. That is the universal truth, in fact. And in this Pachaya Sutta also saying the same kind of thing. Very important here, realize. Now, what is the dependent arising? From birth, as a requisite condition, comes aging and death. Whether or not there is a arising of Tathagata, this property stands. This regularity of the Dhamma, this orderliness of the Dhamma, that conditionality is always there. In other words, the Buddha comes out only teach us about this dependent arising. Everything is changing. But this idea of everything is changing is always there. In other words, it's a universal truth. And this truth always stands there. The Buddha only recognizes these things. From birth come to old age and death. Always like that. In the past is like that. Present is like that. In the future, not only applied to the Chinese, to all the world. All the human beings, all the animals, all the things. So that is a very important realization. And here it says that Tathagata, you can say, directly awakens to that. So the Buddha sat down at the Bodhi tree, he directly awakens to that, and he realizes these kind of things, then breaks through to that. So breaks through to that, we can say is in Chinese, Wu, enlightened upon. Directly awakening, breaking through that, he declares it, teaches it, described it, set it forth. That means the Buddha sat down at the Bodhi tree, he realized this universal truth. After he realized universal truth, he come out to teach us. That's why in the whole Buddhist text we can say is he's teaching us this very important truth, universal truth. That's why here it says that he reveals it, explains it, make it plain and say, look, from birth as a requisite condition comes age and death. So in so many different kind of ways, all different kind of Buddhist teachings, we can say is that the Buddha wanted to demonstrate us is that universal law is there, and we have to realize this, and there is no other ways to against this. We cannot against it, but we can only to realize this. So that is a very important thing. In other words, this truth stand forever. Stand forever. And this truth, only the Buddha is only a discovery. He discovered this truth, awakened this truth, and to tell us. So that is a very important idea. So this truth stayed forever is a very important idea. The Buddha, Sakyamuni Buddha, become a symbol of this truth, become an embodiment of this truth. That's why we say the Buddha lives forever. Why the Buddha lives forever? Because this truth lives forever. Dependent arising, this truth lives forever. That's why the Buddha also lives forever. Because this truth can be applied to the computer, to the everything. Therefore, we say the computer is a demonstration of this truth. And because of this truth, the Buddha is there. So that is the ideal. So this, of course, applies to the physics. The physics, we can say, is that they strictly following this truth. Dependent arising. We human beings also following this truth, but the psychological life of us, the human beings, although following the nature of physical truth, but Buddhism also saying that there is a freedom of will. In other words, we can have our choices. That is different from others. That's why the text saying that whether or not there is a arising of this Tathagata or the Buddha, whether the good Buddha arises in this world to discover it, but this truth is always there. It's truth. But here, I must say a little bit about the truth. Truth in Buddhism called Satya. So this truth means reality. Very important. In Buddhism, truth means reality. That means the Buddha saying this reality. Therefore, the Buddhist truth is not about proportional truth, something proposed, but a truth looking at the reality of the world, reality about human life. So this truth, the Buddha realized it. And this truth, he comes out and teach us. That's why this truth stands forever. It's very important. The Buddha only as a discoverer, remember. Just like modern scientists, they discovered so many kind of stars, given so many names. The stars are not their creations, but they discovered. Then the same thing, the Buddha discovered this truth under the Bodhi tree when he sat there to meditate. And this truth he discovered, and he also discovered that this truth can apply to human life. We as human beings also following this truth. If we live against this truth, then our life will be miserable. So that is the truth. That's why the text we have already read about this already. It says that the Buddha directly awakens to. That repeated several times. The first one is the Buddha directly awakens to this one. Then he says, breaks through that. In fact, these two are the same kind of idea. Then the third is directly awakening, breaking through to that. He declares, teaches it, describes it. That means he awakens to this and comes to teach us. In other words, he realized something very important. This is so important to our human life that he come out and teach us. So the Buddha is only a discoverer. Therefore, in Buddhism, there is no savior. The Buddha is not a savior. The Buddha is only a teacher in this sense. He teaches the truth. And with this introduction, we come back to the dependent arising. First thing we need to understand is what this theory called dependent arising not intended to explain. Many people misunderstand this, and they try to explain the origin of the universe, origin of the human life. Particularly, these two are not intended by this theory. In other words, this theory won't explain this kind of things, the origin of the universe, ultimate beginning. For example, today, the physical science says the Big Bang. The whole universe started from a Big Bang. But Big Bang itself is still a theory. In truth, we don't know. Because the universe is so huge that, nobody knows. That's why those who discuss about the origin of the universe according to Buddhism is meaningless. Why? Because even you spend 100 years, today it's 2,000, 3,000 years. There's nobody, know about these things. Second is that the origin about life, the very beginning of life, that is also something nobody knows. Of course, Western scientist Darwin says, we human beings come from apes. But before apes, also other lives, so many lives. There's no beginning. Therefore, Buddhism never wanted to discuss these kind of questions. That's why the Buddha said, the first beginning of existence is something inconceivable. In other words, the first beginning of this universe cannot be known. You shall never to discuss these kind of things. That's why this truth is not to discuss these kind of things. So this sense in Buddhism is called unanswered questions. Buddhism never gave any answer to these questions. For example, here I listed, this is a typical in India religions, they all discuss these kind of questions. For example, is the world eternal? Is it not eternal? Is the world finite? Or is the world infinite? Is the soul, the body the same or different? After death, what that happened? So all these questions are not discussed in Buddhism. Buddhism leaves this as unanswered questions. Buddhism do not discuss these things. But you will certainly ask, why? Why Buddhism didn't answer these questions? That is because Buddhism is a practical religion. Buddhism wanted to solve human problems. Discussing about the universe, discussing about very beginning of the life does not contribute to solving our present problems. So none of the other religions are so practical as Buddhism. Perhaps we can say Confucianism is very practical, just like Buddhism, concerning only about human life and wants to find the solution to human problems. Therefore, Buddhism focuses only on the practical questions and finding a solution to the human problems, human sufferings. That is the most important thing. That's why we can say the only aim for Buddhism is to help human beings, help us to find the solution to our problems. Therefore, if anything deviates from this goal, Buddhism does not want to discuss. So this is here in the Chula Manonkhya Buddha. Manonkhya is the Buddha's disciple, and he is the person also and come here to the Buddha saying that I want to know the answers to these questions. As we discussed earlier, these are the questions, the 10 questions, classical questions. Manonkhya Buddha here asked the Buddha saying that I want to know the answers to these questions, asked the Buddha. And this is the Buddha's the answer to him. He said, the Buddha said, the word eternal I have left undeclared. What I have left undeclared because it is unbeneficial, it does not belong to the fundamentals of holy life, then we say practice of Buddhism. It does not lead to disenchantment, dispassion, to cessation, to peace, to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, to demand. That is why I have left it undeclared. So here, the Buddha make it very clear, because these kind of questions does not lead one to here cessation, peace, direct knowledge. So direct knowledge here refers to knowledge about our life. Enlightenment here also enlightenment refers to enlightenment about our life. Nibbana, of course, is the end of human suffering. That's why after declare this clearly, then the Buddha said, and what I have declared, this is suffering, directly. This is human suffering. Then he said, I declared. This is the origin of human suffering, I have declared. This is the cessation of human suffering, I have declared. This is the way leading to the cessation of the human suffering, I have declared. So he has very clearly saying that those who questions do not leading to end of human suffering, then he will never discuss. And those questions only relate to human suffering, he's clearly discussed it. So that is a very practical idea. Practical to such extent that anything related to human life, he discussed all of them. Anything does not lead to solving human problem, he never discussed it. That is so practical to Buddhism. That's why these questions about the origin of the universe, origin of the human beings, or life on earth, Buddhism never discussed because it has nothing to do with our present problem, with our present situations. That's why it's a very practical guide. It is from here we also can say is that Buddhism is concerned only with human suffering, nothing else. That's why the Buddha said here in the text, the one text called Alakatubama Sutta, the Buddha told his disciples directly saying that, monks, both formerly and now, I teach only suffering and the cessation of suffering. In other words, in the whole life, the Buddha lived up to 80 years, and he got enlightened at the age of 35. From the age of 35 till he died, there are 45 years. During these 45 years, he said that he teach nothing but only suffering and cessation of suffering. Teach suffering means he focusing on analysis of the human suffering, finding its causes and finding its solutions. That's why, in other words, the whole Buddhist teaching is focusing on human sufferings, nothing else. Nothing else. That is the whole purpose. That's why dependent arising does not want it to apply to any other kind of things away from this. And in order to illustrate this kind of point, the Buddha also gave many similes. For example, here, the Buddha using the forest, and using the forest leaves, and he taken up a handful of leaves, and he told his disciples, which is more, the leaves in my hand or the leaves in the forest? His disciple, of course, thought the leaves in the forest are much more than the leaves in his hand. Then the Buddha said, what he taught, just like the leaves in the hand. In other words, he might know a lot of things, but he teach only those knowledge directly related to human suffering and cessation of the suffering. That is very clear. So in order to analyze human suffering, he used dependent arising to analyze this. So dependent arising, as we said earlier, It's a universal law, and this universal law can also apply to human life. That's why he's using this dependent arising to analyze human life in order to find the causes to human problems. So here, what this dependent arising wanted to explain is, as we said earlier, there are two applications, dependent arising. Dependent arising, first there is a general application. Second is a special application. The general application is that this law can be applied to the whole universe. So in other words, the whole universe is operating on dependent arising. Physical science today, modern physical science told us about this, and the whole universe is working on condition and causes and effects. So this is called universal law. So this law, exactly today, modern science told us, as I said earlier, Lao Tzu also realized these kind of things. Kongzi also realized these kind of things. All realize there is a universal law, but just giving different names. Buddhism calls this as a dependent arising, and others call different kind of names. In other words, the whole universe working on this one principle. And even regarding to the human life is also the consciousness. When it arises, there are also causes and conditions. The moral order, for example, also there are causes and consequences. Our humans' cognitive process also there are causes and conditions. The same kind of things. In other words, this law governs the entire universe. So that means generally to apply to everything in the universe. Second is a special application. So this special application is to apply human life. Why this especially applied to human life? Because, as we said earlier, the Buddha wanted to find the causes to human problems. And using this dependent arising as a method to find the causes of the human problems. So in order to understand about these applications, we need to understand the word and the all, because in the Buddhist text, using these two terms to interpret about human life. So what is the word then? Here, this is one of the Buddhist texts. Here, the Samiti is another one of the Buddha's disciples, asked the Buddha, what is the word? You always talk about the word. And then, here, the Buddha said, wherever, Samiti, there is an I, visible form, visual consciousness, and the sense perceptible with the visual consciousness, there lies the word. There lies the concept of the word. Wherever there is a ear, nose, tongue, body, and the mind, there lies the word. There lies the concept of the word. So here, in this, the Buddhist definition of the word is not the ordinary word, the physical word, but the word of the human experience. So this word of the human experience is the word Buddhism wanted to explain. And that is the most important part of the Buddhist teaching. And this word of the human experience consisted of what? Is our six faculties, the eye, the ear, the nose, the tongue, the body, and the mind as six. And this called the six faculties. And together with the corresponding six objects, the eye sees also the colors, the shapes, the sizes, the ear listening to the sound, all this. And plus this also, there are six consciousness. When the eye says something outside, the eye consciousness arises. So this is the word of the human experience. And this world of the human experience is so important to Buddhism. Therefore, Buddhism focusing on analyze this world of the human experience. Why? Because we as human beings, we live in this world of human experience. So this human experience, we can say is that, for example, in this room, 15 of us, for example, today, and each one of us, our experience about this room, for example, is not exactly the same. If I ask all of you to write 500 words describing about this classroom, two of you will have the same exact experience. Why? Because our cognitive interpretation, each one of us is different. Therefore, we interpret this experience differently, and we think this is as true. Therefore, we live according to these interpretations. That's why Buddhism said we need to understand this world of experience. When we understand this world of experience, we will not stick to it, attach to it, because this world of experience much more is subjective to our own interpretation. Why? Because all of you come into this room, you have your experience about this room, but you are not simply interpreting present moment, but you always, get your past experience also getting into interpretation this room, interpretation about this lecture and everything. That's why this human world of the human experience, each one of us, we create our own world of human experience. It is because of this, each one of us, our human experience is different from all others. So this is the most important part, and Buddhism wanted to analyze. Second is about the all. This is similar to the first one, about human experience. So the all here refers to the entirety of the human experience. In other words, entirety of the human conscious, remember here again, conscious experience. Entirety of the human conscious experience is called all, totalities. So this is also in a sutta. One of the Buddha's disciples come and ask the Buddha about this all. He asked the Buddha about what is all. Then the Buddha told him, this is all. It's called the Sabha Sutta. Sabha means all. Here said, and what, monks, is the all? The eye and form, the ear and sound, the nose and odor, the tongue and taste, the body, tangible object, the mind and mental phenomena. This is called the all. So here again coming back to the eye, the ear, the nose, the tongue, the body and the mind, and then the form, sound, odor, all these things. In fact, the content is same as before. But here, using another word called all. Therefore, the Buddha said, if anyone bhikkhus, monks, shall speak thus, having recognized this all, I shall make no another all, that would be a mere empty boast on his part. If he were questioned, he would not be able to reply, and further, he would meet with vexation. For what reasons? Because monks, that would not be within his domain. In other words, in our domain, in our mind and conscious experience, all related to the six faculties and corresponding objects. There is no anything outside these kind of things. So here refers to, again, is the human experience. It's just put into different terminologies. In other words, our human life is consisted of our human experience. And this human experience is the most important part of the Buddhist teaching. And Buddhism wanted to analyze this human experience in order to understand it. Because within this human experience, we created so many things. And then after the creation of these things, then we attach to it as true, as real. In reality, they are not true. They are not real. But we attach to it. That's why Buddhism wanted to analyze this. That's why when we say the word means individual human experience. Individual human experience is what Buddhism wanted to, really dive into this and analyze this and also understand it. Because human suffering comes from a misunderstanding of the human world experience. That's why the Buddha says that, practicing dependent arising leading to true knowledge, direct knowledge. What kind of direct knowledge? And this knowledge is about the world of the human experience again. Therefore, the Buddha wanted to have this knowledge about human world experience. Therefore, compressing both the knowledge and the know. That means we must understand our world of experience. In other words, simply our life. It's only when we understand our life, then we know the causes and conditions of our sufferings. That's why this word, human experience, that is the main part for the dependent arising to explain. Therefore, the dependent arising mainly to explain the world of the human experience. That is the Buddhism wanted us to understand. It is from here, then Buddhism using this called 12 links to discuss this. So these 12 links, you can say it's explain the causal structure of the human experience. This is the causes, as the consequences, causes and consequences. And this discourses the causal annexes, the origin about these things. This is usually start with ignorance, and because of ignorance, we have conditional activities. In other words, we have all different kind of karmas, creating karmas. And from there's consciousness. So these are usually called the past two factors. The present factor, many consciousness, mind and matter, sixth sphere of the senses, contact, feeling, craving, grasping, and becoming. So these are the present, and birth and death, sorrow are the future. So these 12 factors you can see here, it's emphasizing the present here. Present. From contact come to feeling. From feeling we come to craving. Craving is one of the very important link to break. That's why Buddhism saying that craving is one of the defilements, and we need to understand and break through. One of the very important the Buddha's realization when he sat down at the Bodhi tree is to realize that all of the human problems is coming back to ignorance. That is the most important realization of the Buddha we can see. In other words, Buddhism, when discussing about human life and analyze human life, and find the causes back to ignorance, not to any other outside causes or anything outside, but find the causes within us. And because of ignorance, we created so many kind of wrong ideas and thoughts. And then we, stick to this wrong idea of thought as true. And then we attach to it, and then we suffer. That's why this ignorance, we can say, is one of the very important cause the Buddha discovered. And this discovery, we can say, is that no any other religions, discuss in these ways. This discussion, going back to the ignorance means that this does not blame anybody for our human sufferings, but it traces to our own responsibilities. From this, I just put here is these are the 12 factors. Usually we put this as a past factor, and the present factor, so many of them, and future factors. So that is called 3 lives, causes related to 3 lives. That's a simple description. And although in these 12 link causes, and each of them, in fact, we discuss only one, but we shall not understand that at each moment only one cause is there. For example, here we come back. When we start to discuss conditional activities, when conditional activity when discussed here, it's just highlight the most important cause. But at the same time, there are also other causes working together with this. Therefore, these causes are not isolated, but they are working together. That is a very important understanding. Therefore, although in the dependent arising, we discuss each one of them, but this is in order for us to explain these things easily. But in reality, in our life, all these causes working together, all. For example, we said earlier, ignorance, for example. Ignorance exists there, it's because we have this, name and form. Physical body endowed with consciousness, feeling, perception, and volitional formation, all are there. That's why in any kind of a gathering situation, there are so many causes and conditions working together. But there is one condition or one cause, which is a chief, which is a main cause, and that main cause is taken out and discussed. That's why Buddhism say these multiple conditions, they are co-arising, co-disappearing. Rising together, disappearing together. They are always working together. That's why we call the multiple conditions leading to multiple effects. They work always together, not just a single one. And we single out only the most important one and to discuss. That's why when we put it properly, we can say it's co-dependent. That means all dependent on together arises and dependent on each other and disappears. So that is coming back to earlier, we say that Buddhism only recognizes that multiple causes leading to multiple effects. So here, when we discuss these 12 factors, it's demonstrated quite clearly. So with this, we come back to is 5 aggregates, for example. 5 aggregates consisted of the human life. The 5 aggregates, they are called, I didn't put here, yes, here. The physical form, the feeling, perception, volitional formation, and also consciousness. These are the 5. So these 5, in fact, they are always working together. You cannot separate them. It is only when the 5 aggregates working together, then we as a human being, it cannot be separated, in fact. That's why it's called all together working as a co-arising, as a human being. It's only when we, in a certain point, we want to come out and discuss a particular important thing, then we single out one cause only. And in this, it's a circle. Dependent horizon is a circle. Although we start with ignorance, but ignorance is not the first cause, in fact. Because ignorance exists right now. We still have ignorance. In the future, we still have ignorance. Therefore, it's a dynamic, interdependent, circle. In this circle, in fact, according to Buddhism, you can break in any part of this circle. But Buddhism usually start with craving. Craving as the most important part as a circle. So the senses is as a circle, therefore, ignorance is just, skillfully put as the first cause in order to explain. Otherwise, we cannot explain it clearly. But in fact, ignorance is accessed in any stage in our life. So ignorance, Buddhism calls, because of this interpretation about life, we know that there is no permanent entity because these are all continuous, process. Causes leading to effects. Effects serving as causes leading to other effects. Therefore, we cannot find any kind of permanent entity, and in this process, therefore, this entity we can call the self, soul, any kind of things. That's why here the Buddha said, materiality or matter is impermanent, rather, his disciple. And so are feelings and sensations and perceptions and volitional formations and consciousness. In other words, all the five aggregates, all of them are impermanent, changing, always changing. None of them are permanent. Because none of them are permanent, a combination of them also impermanent. And in this sense, therefore, Buddhism totally rejects self or soul. So it's because of dependent horizon. It is here that the Vajra said this verse, and very beautifully put here. He says, there is no such a thing as a person, just a collection of changing aggregates. Similar to character is a name various parts. In other words, human being is only a process, as we said earlier. And in this process, we gave different names as matters, as a feeling, sensation, a perception, volitional formation, consciousness. We gave different names. But only in reality, only a process. And this process, Buddhism calls this as a world of a human experience. Therefore, Buddhism comes to the conclusion is that whatever is impermanent is suffering. Whatever is suffering is no self. This is a logical conclusion because according to the Buddhist teaching is that because the dependent horizon leading to that everything is impermanent. Because in this world, everything is dependent on each other. Therefore, nothing is permanent, everything is impermanent. Because there is impermanent, there is suffering. So here, suffering means conditioned state of life. Because of this conditioned state, then there is no impermanent self. No self, it's in the Chinese Buddhist situation usually interpreted as emptiness. Therefore, emptiness is also another statement of no self, no permanent self. So that is a Buddhist interpretation. Therefore, Buddhism using is that ultimately, when we talk about human life, Buddhism says there is no permanent soul, permanent a kind of entity, anything. But in our daily speech, we still use I, you, all these words. Therefore, Buddhism says that is called the conventional truth. We accept this because we as human beings, it's only through our language then we can communicate. We can exchange. Without language, we can't do this. Therefore, on the conventional level, we still accept human, languages. But in the ultimate sense, Buddhism totally rejects the idea of I being, all different kind of entity. Because in our daily language, we can't see that this is a combination of 5 aggregates. So the 5 aggregates is working, 5 aggregates is eating, 5 aggregates is drinking. Nobody can accept this kind of expressions. That's why Buddhism accepts the normal expression, all these kind of text, these words. That's why even in early Buddhism, using these 2 truths called. That's why we must understand that when Buddhism says there is no permanent identity called the soul, that is the ultimate truth. In the final analysis, there is no permanent entity. That is in order to overcome our human cravings. Human cravings is all because we have an I, we have a permanent idea, So for this, then we say the computer is mine, and the bottle is mine, everything is mine. Because of this I, so we crave. Therefore, Buddhism wanted to destroy the very idea of I, so say no soul, no self. So that is a very important idea to destroy. I think already 11:30, so we have a short break.